What's up everyone, welcome to Workshop Rebuild. In today's video, I'll be taking the Yanmar 3TNV82A engine, which I've previously rebuilt, and I'll be placing it back into the John Deere 1445. Once everything is lined up within this machine, I'll hook up the starter, the alternator, and some of the wiring that has to go onto this engine. Right after that, I'll focus on the coolant system. So I'm going to hook up the radiator and whatnot. That all has to go behind the engine. And once everything is hooked up, I can fire this engine up for the first time within this machine. So fingers crossed everything goes well, but right now let's focus on the assembly. The Yanmar engine is suspended in the air. On the left side, we have a little bit room between the oil filter and these hydraulic lines that go to the oil cooler in the back and the fuel filter. So we should be able to pass right through there and place the engine in there. And then on the right, there's a little bit more room. So as you guys can tell, there's some more room right there. The biggest concern is the valve cover right here that might touch up against the bottom of this cab. So what I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna put the engine a little bit forwards, down, until this bore lines up with that engine mount right down there. The engine install was a slow process as I didn't want to bump the sheet metal oil pan on the rear axle, nor did I want to damage the valve cover on top of the engine. With a little bit of patience and finesse, the engine lined up perfectly with the rear mounting point. On the flywheel end of the engine, I mounted a cross member. This bolts onto the engine and it allows it to sit on the two front engine mounts. If you ever need to remove your John Deere 1445 engine, I'd highly recommend removing this plate, as it'll be much easier to take it out of the machine. Now with the engine in place, it's time to tighten the driveshaft coupler to the flywheel adapter plate from underneath of the machine. After making sure everything lined up, it's time to torque down the bolts. The driveshaft bolts have been torqued to 49 Newton meters of torque to the flywheel adapter plate. Now I got to make sure the engine is in line with the hydraulic pump, and I'll share with you guys how I do that. I'm inside the John Deere 1445, and what we're looking at right now is the Yanmar diesel engine right here. This part right here is the flywheel. That right there is the drive shaft that leads to the hydraulic pump. And our goal is to line up the diesel engine and make sure it's in line with the drive shaft that goes to the hydraulic pump. Now if our flywheel and if our engine is off just by a couple degree, we will have some issues on this U-joint because it will cause vibrations. And then that rubber damper right there will also rip much easier. So what we want to do is make sure everything is in line to the hydraulic pump. That way we won't cause any damage to any of these components. Now to do that, we're going to go off of these two frame rails that are welded into the machine. And that way we'll have a nice straight line. So I have a ruler square right here, and I'm going to go based off of the ruler, and I'm going to put the camera to the left, and you'll see it's perfectly parallel with the drive shaft right now. So that means the drive shaft is nice and straight all the way up until this point. Now the flywheel hooks up to the drive shaft right there, but that means the engine could just be tilted off to the side, and our furthest point out on the drive shaft could be in line. So now what we have to do is actually move the engine on the back end to make sure it's in line. And another way you can check to see if your engine is in line is actually to go off of the flywheel. So I moved the ruler and I put the light in a different position so you guys have a better view on the flywheel. So we know we're in line right now, but we also have to be square on the front of the engine. That way the crankshaft will be in line with the drive shaft. And to do that, we're going to look at the face of this flywheel, and we're going to look down on this cross member, and we're going to make sure that's parallel. So if I go forwards, you'll see the gap is parallel, and if we come a little bit back, you'll notice it's perfectly in line. Even though the engine is now lined up to the hydraulic pump, I want to make sure I tighten all three bolts to this John Deere 1445 on the engine mounts. After all three bolts are tightened, I want to verify that everything is still in line. After I do that, I can continue with this assembly. The only reason why I removed the rear wheels was to drop the engine into the John Deere 1445 with the engine hoist. Now I can put them back on and drop the machine onto the ground for the last time. With the John Deere 1445 back on the ground, I'm going to start assembling parts around this engine. So right back there, there's a hole, and that's where the starter goes. This right here is the starter. It's very clean because I cleaned it up and I took it apart and greased it internally, so everything works really nicely. And these two bolts have to go right down in there. So let's get this installed and then we'll do some other stuff. There's enough room to get the starter in from the right side of the machine, and it bolts down to the engine mounting plate with 2 bolts. The next part I'm going to install will be the alternator. This will bolt onto the timing cover and onto an adjustment bracket above. Right after that, I'll install the V-belt and make sure it has good tension on it between all pulleys. The next thing I'll be doing on this John Deere 1445 is sorting out the wiring harness. The wiring harness has multiple connectors, and these have to be connected to the engine. The connectors have to be clean and they have to be connected properly, or else we might have some issues with the startup, which isn't good. We might not have any lights on the dash, which is also not good. That means we wouldn't know what the engine is actually doing, so it's really important to get these connectors right. So let's get to it. The positive lead from the battery goes to the copper starter terminal, and this distributes power throughout the machine. On the same terminal, you'll have wires that need 12 volt power throughout the machine, and even the alternator output wire goes here too. After that, I connected the block heater wire, which was in the same area. The rest of the wiring harness goes up and around the engine because we need to have feedback from our coolant temperature sensor right next to the thermostat. On the other end of the engine, I have the last connectors. One goes to the glow plug rail, and you'll see that right here. The 3-wire connector goes to the fuel shutoff solenoid. One wire supplies up to 30 amps to retract the solenoid, which opens the fuel within the injection pump, and the other wire supplies 5 amps to keep it in that position. The 3rd wire is your negative lead. The last connector leads to your oil pressure sending unit, which is super important, so make sure it's clean and it's working the way it should. All the wires are now connected to this engine, and I hope I got everything right, but we'll figure that out later on in this video when I try and go and start up this machine. But right now I'll focus on the exhaust, then I'll mount the radiator, the oil cooler, and all of those other bits and pieces that go on the back of the John Deere 1445. The exhaust pipe is relatively easy to install. One end goes into the exhaust muffler, and the other end goes onto the exhaust manifold. Next, I installed the cooling fan and used some blue Loctite on all 4 bolts, then torqued them to 11 Newton meters. After that, I focused on the radiators, first the coolant radiator and then the hydraulic oil cooler on top of it. To connect the lines, I have to remove the temporary plugs I installed, and that one almost flew into the intake. I'm so lucky it actually missed. The top radiator hose connects to the top of the water pump, and it will be secured with 2 hose clamps. This will ensure a leak-free system. The air intake needs a good filtering system, so I'm installing an air filter box with a 2-stage filter. This goes on top of the engine and merges with the air intake system. Last but not least, I will mount the reservoir tank. This indicates your coolant level, high or low. Now all the components are mounted around this engine on the John Deere 1445, and I can cover it up with this hood. Originally it was a little bit faded, but I polished it up with some polishing paste and it turned out really well. Now over here I also have another panel that actually goes on the side right over there towards the fuel tank, and there's also one on the opposite side. But right now let's install these 2 parts, and then we'll fire up the John Deere 1445 for the first time after the engine rebuild. So for the initial startup of this John Deere 1445, I'll mount the InstaGo 3 camera right here on my cap. So this way you guys will have a first-person angle of how I start this machine up. So let's get right to it. So I'm going to walk up to the John Deere 1445, open up the door. It's a little bit higher off the ground, so you guys got to somehow climb in here. I'm inside the cab right now. This right here is the steering wheel. Now on the left you'll see the throttle. That's full throttle. That's idle or low. And I'll bump it up to like mid-range for the initial startup because I want to wear in the rings on this freshly rebuilt engine very well. Now on the right you'll see the ignition switch. Nevertheless, let's get to the startup. I'm going to turn over the ignition switch, and you'll see up above the glow plugs are on a timer, so they'll shut off in just a little moment. And you'll also see the PTO light is on and the oil pressure. Once these lights go off, that means you have oil pressure and your PTO is actually off. So let's press the brake first and turn over the key. Now I'm going to go backwards. The John Deere 1445 rebuild project is coming to an end. This will probably be the last video of this machine because I don't have to do anything on this machine anymore other than some minor touch-ups like adding a front headlight and some other little bits and pieces, which probably isn't really interesting for you guys. But to give you guys a little backstory on this, I picked this up for pretty cheap. The engine was shot and it didn't work, so I had to rebuild the engine. And if you guys haven't seen that video yet, you guys can click here up above. After the engine rebuild, it went right back into this machine, and today I fired it up for the first time. It was smoky for about 20 to 30 minutes, but after that it actually cleared up and it doesn't smoke anymore. So that means the engine is running the way it should, and it's also timed correctly. If you guys still have any smoke on your engine after a rebuild, let's say it's running for 30 minutes to an hour and you still have some smoke, you might have some issues with your injection pump, with your injectors, or even some timing that you messed up within your engine. So you might want to have a look at that once more before you let it run for much longer. Other than that, this machine runs and operates the way it should, so I'm really happy with that. There were some minor touch-ups that I had to do. I had to repair some axle seals on the front and on the rear axles. Those have been sealed off, so the oil is now within the axles and it won't leak anymore. And then right after that, I gave this machine a cosmetic makeover, so now it also looks a little bit more presentable, and this way it'll hopefully last a little bit longer. If you guys enjoyed this John Deere 1445 video series, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't already, because hopefully I'll find some more machines like this or some other machines that need some attention that I can repair in the future. If you guys have any suggestions what I should pick up in the near future, leave a comment down below because I'm open to anything if it has an engine in it. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in an upcoming video. Peace.